Welcome to this week's briefing. On Monday, the Times Africa CEO conference takes place in London, and we at Oxford Analytica are delighted to partner with the Times in looking after that event. We're providing input to the plenary sessions and some of the workshops, and we've produced a briefing booklet in association with that event, about which I'll say something more in a moment. We've also published for clients our quarterly outlook for Africa, and I'm going to just explore some of the dimensions that we covered there with my colleague Dr. Joe Ford, Senior Africa Analyst. One of the things we certainly said looking at the outlook, Joe, for the economies of the region was the dependence that they have on the wider world, and that, of course, is an issue given the poor performance of Europe this year.
That's right, Graham. It's not just the continued connection and integration of many African economies, most African economies, to established or traditional or Western markets. But the other issue, particularly in the near term, is elevated global oil prices. So it's not merely events in Europe, but in the Middle East and the Gulf, both for oil and non-oil economies, but especially the non-oil economies in Africa, and the way in which that elevated oil price, which may rise,
given Iran and what have you.
Exactly. In this sort of near term, feeds into other pricing issues in those economies, food prices. Yeah. So countries, especially in East Africa, that faced significant food price inflation in the last year or so, the same conditions don't necessarily exist for that. For example, the rains have come in some of those parts. But still, those pressures will remain very real. And of course, food price inflation doesn't only bring economic risks, but to more fragile governmental setups, it can create political risks too.
When we think of oil in Africa and we think of oil and food in Africa, then the country that comes to mind very much is Nigeria, where these have been very salient concerns from an economic point of view, and with the subsidies issue from a political point of view. Crucial to keep an eye on Nigeria. It's one of what we call our pivotal powers. Very big economy, very big population. What are the key things there?
Well, again, in the near term, we've had our prospects series running, and in the latest prospects for Africa, a lot of the focus was on Nigeria's near-term policy agenda. We saw a manifestation of it. You mentioned the fuel subsidy, the attempt in January to lift that fuel subsidy, along with the fuel subsidy issue, which hasn't necessarily gone away. The government has backtracked a bit. There are a number of other oil-related, I suppose, issues in the quarter to look for. Yeah. One is the petroleum industry bill, and whether there'll be any momentum on that finally in 2012. It's been watched quite closely for some months and years, in fact.
What does it do, essentially, that bill?
It attempts to reform and consolidate the industry in a sense, in a way that hasn't been done.
In a rationalised way.
Yes, and
a transparent way, perhaps.
For a generation, really, to some extent. Related is our plans for a sovereign wealth fund for Nigeria to try and harness its oil wealth for you mentioned the demographic issues in Nigeria for future generations. But we don't expect a great deal of movement in the next quarter. It's an issue which raises all sorts of very complicated issues, mainly around the relationship between the federal and state governments. And when oil revenues are concerned, those are very difficult issues.
The focus, of course, in Nigeria has also been on something that is not food and not oil related, and that is Boko Haram.
That's correct.
And there's a heavy toll in human life continuing.
Indeed, and you did mention Nigeria as a pivotal power, and indeed it is economically, and its internal demand dynamics speak to that both now and in the longer term. But its role as a sort of, and its generally benevolent and positive role as a regional power broker and conflict resolution actor, it's to some extent distracted from that role at present, given its internal security problems. The other issue I'd just mention is privatization in the electricity sector in Nigeria in 2012, something to look for, whether that actually again proceeds or not.
Which, if it does happen, is privatisation on a scale unmatched really in the electricity sector, certainly on the continent and probably elsewhere too.
Absolutely, and it's one of the issues, power is one of the 4 issues that we'll be looking at on Monday
well,
at the
right.
conference.
And in fact, I was going to say before we close that we ought perhaps just to focus a little bit on some of the sectors that will be the centre of concern for people attending the conference and indeed for investors in the continent generally. Consumer, finance, energy, transport, telecoms, just a couple of things before we wind up about some of the more promising areas there, if you would.
The organisers have chosen 4 sectors to look at. Agribusiness is an obvious first one whenever one thinks of sub-Saharan economies, and there the distinction is really between whether one's looking at short and longer term decisions, because there are countries such as Angola and the DRC where in the short term one wouldn't consider them necessarily options. So a lot of the discussion I anticipate will be around distinguishing between what are shorter term sort of investment options or plays and longer term real possibilities. The other sectors are to some extent interconnected, so whether one's talking about resources or infrastructure or transport, power, and a lot of those issues have regional dimensions. So if you look around the sort of, again, East African transport, infrastructure, energy equations. One of the sectors that's not mentioned specifically by the organisers is retail, and a significant consumer base, middle class, growing in Africa, and there, of course, the questions often come back again to Nigeria.
Yeah, good, Joe. Thanks very much. Well, that's it for this week. I very much hope we can see you at the Times Africa Conference in London on Monday. If that, however, is not possible, do visit our website on that day and download our briefing book prepared for the purpose, and indeed for our continuing coverage of Africa. In the meantime, thanks for watching.